The Man with the Endless Shadow. In the village of Talth, nestled in the crook of a mountain's elbow, there lived a man named Timothy. He was a quiet soul, a tanner by trade, whose hands were stained the color of old bark, and whose eyes held the distant look of one who spends his days with the dead skins of animals. He was neither tall nor short, neither handsome nor plain. He was, for all purposes, a man easily forgotten. And perhaps that was why it began. It was the first day of the harvest moon when Timothy noticed it. He was walking home from the river, his shadow stretched long and thin in the amber light of dusk. He paused to watch the sun sink behind the mountain's peak, a daily ritual of his, a moment of silent prayer to the old gods of stone and sky. He lifted his hand to shield his eyes, and his shadow lifted its hand too. But as he lowered his hand, he could have sworn, just for a flicker, that the shadow's hand stayed raised for a breath longer. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and told himself it was the trick of the light. The harvest moon was fat and low, and the air was thick with dust from the threshing. Shadows were bound to be strange. The next day, it was undeniable. His shadow was longer, not by a hand's breadth, but by the span of his forearm. It stretched not behind him, but slightly to the left, as if it were leaning, straining, like a dog on a taut leash. He paced his workshop, measuring his steps. The shadow moved with him, but its tip, its very furthest point, curled like a finger pointing past his house, past the well, toward the dark line of the whispering woods. Timothy told no one. What would he say? "Goodwife Anya, my shadow has grown an inch, fetch the priest." He was a man of practical things, hides, salt, and the stitching of leather. A man's shadow was a thing of science, of sun and angle. He dismissed it. By the end of the first week, the shadow reached the door of his cottage, and spilled out into the yard like a puddle of ink. By the end of the second week, it had crossed the village green. This was when the children noticed. They pointed, they laughed. They stood on the shadow's tip, and dared each other to let it touch them. But as they stood there, their own shadows pale and quivering, Timothy's shadow did not stay still. It writhed, just a little at its farthest edge, as if it were tasting the air for something. The old women began to whisper. They spoke of the soul thief, a creature from the before time, that fed on the forgotten spaces of men's hearts. They said a man's shadow was his anchor to the world, and if it grew too long he would be dragged away, piece by piece, into the realm of echoes. Timothy stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. He lay in his cot at night, his shadow slithering out the window like a serpent, pointing unerringly at the dark tree line of the whispering woods. He felt a pull in his chest, a deep and hollow ache, as if his navel were tied to a star that was falling away from him. "What are you chasing?" he whispered to his own dark self. The shadow did not answer. It merely grew. On the 21st day, Timothy woke to find his shadow had crossed the village boundary, and was now a long black river that flowed past the mill, past the smithy's forge, and into the first gnarled oaks of the forest. The sun was high, but his shadow was longer than the oldest tree. The village elders gathered in a huddle, their faces gray with fear. They came to him at dusk. "You must go," said the headman, a man named Gary whose beard was woven with copper charms. "You must follow it to its end. A shadow that chases is a soul that calls. If you do not answer, the shadow will take you by force, and you will become a hollow man, a ghost that walks among us, but is not seen." "Follow it?" said Timothy. Timothy's voice was a dry rustle. "It leads into the woods. No one who enters the whispering woods returns. No one who stays here will be safe," Gary said, his eyes grave. "Your shadow has already touched the well. It has touched the children's skipping stones. Tomorrow, it will touch the temple stone. And the day after, it will touch us." So Timothy packed a bag. He took a water skin, a flint, a dried strip of his own tanned leather, and the knife he used to slit the throats of sheep. He did not take a lantern, for he knew his shadow needed no light. At the edge of the woods, he turned back one last time. The villagers stood in a silent row, their own shadows small and frightened at their feet. His own shadow stretched out before him, a black path leading into the unknown. "Show me," he said, and he stepped into the forest. The whispering woods were not silent. They were filled with murmurs, not of leaves, but of voices, half-formed, forgotten words that skittered like insects through the air. His shadow did not slow. It pushed through brambles without snagging. slid over moss without disturbing a single spore. Timothy followed, his feet stumbling, his heart pounding. For 3 days and 3 nights he walked. His shadow led him deeper than any woodcutter had ever dared. He saw bones of creatures he could not name, their rib cages like caged music. He saw pools of water that reflected not his face, but his shadow's face, a grinning, desperate thing. On the 3rd night, he came to a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a figure. It was made of absence, a void shaped like a man, but with features that shifted like smoke. It was his shadow's twin. No, it was his shadow's source. "You are what I am chasing," Timothy breathed. The void figure spoke, but not with sound. It spoke with a chill that ran up his spine, a feeling of reaching and yearning. "I am the moment you looked away. I am the prayer you never finished. I am the face in the river you refused to see. I have been calling you since the day you were born, Timothy. I am the part of you that has always been running." Timothy shook his head. "I am not a runner. I am a tanner. I am a man of hides and salt." "Then why," the void whispered, "did you never finish a single thought? Why did you stop your hand halfway to the sun? Why did you love but not enough? Why did you dream but not follow?" And Timothy understood. His shadow was not chasing a thing. It was chasing a version of himself he had abandoned. Every time he had chosen the easy path, the quiet path, the forgotten path, a piece of him had broken off and run ahead into the dark. His shadow was the thread, and the void was the knot. "What must I do?" he asked, his voice a tear in the silence. The void opened its arms. "Embrace me, become whole, or cut me loose, and live as a man with no shadow, a man who casts no doubt, but also casts no light." Timothy looked at his shadow, which now lay still at his feet, reaching toward the void, like a child to a mother. He remembered the village, he remembered the children laughing, the old women whispering, the smell of his own tanning vats. He remembered the quiet life he had built, to hide from the very feeling that now stood before him. He stepped forward, but instead of embracing the void, he knelt. He knelt before his own shadow, and placed both hands upon it. "I will not cut you loose," he said, "and I will not lose myself in you. But I see you now. I see what I buried. I see the fear, the hunger, the lonely wanting. I will not run from you anymore. I will carry you, all of you." He pressed his hands deep into the shadow, and he felt a told like the river in winter, a pull like the tide of the ocean. But he did not let go. He pulled and he pulled, and he pulled the entire length of his shadow back into himself. It was like breathing in a storm. His heart swelled, his ribs ached, his eyes filled with tears that were black as pitch. The void figure screamed, a silent shaking scream, and it began to crumble, piece by piece, like a sandcastle in a wave. It collapsed into the earth, and from its collapse, a single white flower bloomed. Timothy stood. He was whole. He was heavier. He was lighter. He was himself, but himself was larger now. He walked back to Talth in 3 hours, though it had taken him 3 days to enter. The villagers saw him coming and gasped, for behind him stretched only a normal shadow, ordinary, small, and true. "Did you find it?" cried Gary. Timothy looked at the sun, and for the first time he smiled. "I did. It was me." And from that day on, Timothy was no longer forgotten. He was the man who had walked into the whispering woods and walked out again. He was the man who had embraced his own dark and returned with it tamed. His shadow never grew again, but it no longer needed to. It had finally caught what it was chasing, a man willing to stand still and look it in the face. And that, the old ones say, is the only way to outrun anything, to stop running. The village of Talth still tells the tale on the night of the harvest moon. They point to the sky and say, "Look, the stars are just the shadows of gods, chasing us. But we will not be caught, not unless we want to be." And Timothy, now gray and kind, sits by the fire and nods, his shadow resting calmly at his feet, finally at peace. Do you believe we all have a void version of ourselves, the person we might have become if we'd made different choices? If the shadow kept growing and Timothy never followed it, how do you think the story would have ended? Do you think the white flower at the end has a meaning? What does it symbolize to you? Feel free to express yourself below.